at least a snack. My name is Tony Pennington. I'm an aquatic biologist with Environmental Science Associates. I've been doing aquatic plant research and management since about the late 90s. I've been working with Harry Gibbons and Shannon Bradabo from Tetra Tech. We actually used to be colleagues together at that firm, and we continue to work together. And I'm excited to work with Snohomish County, and I think you all are pretty familiar with Marissa and Jen from the county, but I'm really excited to be part of this project. I've worked on a couple of other integrated aquatic vegetation management plans, as have Harry and Shannon. So I think we bring a pretty good team to the project, and hopefully we can get some really good sense of what you see are the problems and come up with some goals to put into this plan. So that's what we're here for, is to hear your thoughts and hopefully get them compiled in a meaningful way. So next slide. So just a brief agenda. We've got 2 hours for this. I think we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to try and stay within our sideboards here. Shannon's our taskmaster for letting largely me and Marissa and Harry know if we're out of line here. But we again went through the introductions and some housekeeping. You know, the general housekeeping is mute yourself if you're not talking. We all have kids and dogs and such in the background. You know, be respectful of others' thoughts and keep an open mind for differing opinions, and let's try and hear what we all have to say. Marissa's going to go over some of the benefits of aquatic plants, and then she's going to cover the survey that they just conducted a couple weeks ago. She'll go over some past management efforts, which may or may not be new information to most people here. And then I'll cover some of the key plants that what I'm hearing are your concerns. I may be off, but that's what I've heard so far. And just briefly kind of touch on what some management options are. We'll take all this information and put it into kind of a roundtable through an interactive whiteboard where we can all have an opportunity to put our thoughts in, or you will have a chance to put your thoughts in. In particular, again, the problems, goals, and then maybe some other concerns. And then we'll talk about what happens from here. So, thanks. And for that, I think, Marissa, I'll turn it over to you for a bit.
Okay. So again, I'm Marissa Bergdorf with Snohomish County. I've met, I think, with most or all of you either in a meeting we kind of had before the grant started, or over email, or unrelated to this, I've seen many of you in the Wakeboat conversations as well. So good to get started, and we're really excited about this. I did want to, for those of you, I think there were a couple that just joined. If you haven't already, if you could put your name and your role of the committee in the chat, that would be on the bottom bar. There'll be a chat function if you could add that in. Since we don't have a lot of time for the meeting, that's kind of how we're tracking who's here and letting everybody see each other and introduce themselves. Since a lot of you already know each other anyways, we decided to handle it that way. So excited to be here. I just thought it would be good to start off and talk about how we're here, what the timeline is in terms of this grant project and what we're looking at to get things going. So as you know, we applied for a grant last fall to develop this plan to make a roadmap for dealing with aquatic invasive plants at Lake Roesiger. And we finally are able to get started in April through June. This actually turned in April through July. We were waiting for a contract from Ecology. And Brian was wonderful in working with our contracts people to get a form for you to provide the grant match, much of which you're providing through in-kind service by your volunteer time here, and the milfoil diving work that you paid Seascapes to do. So thanks to Brian for getting that done and reviewed. Our contract with Ecology actually is still not signed, but we are authorized to spend money on it so we can get started. That should happen. And we've also developed a project website. I sent that out to everybody in the meeting announcement. I didn't get any feedback, so I'm assuming it's perfect. But if you did look at it and you did have any changes, I'm happy to make those. But we'll be sending that out this week to the grant or to the community, so they're aware. A big thing about this whole process is we want to be very transparent with everybody, and that website is the first thing to get going on that. So going along the timeline, the next thing we did is a plant survey. So we saw some of you out there, and Christine Feldman actually came out with this for part of the day, as did another lake resident, to learn the different aquatic plants. So it took us several days to do that. We were combining it with some other projects. We're doing a shoreline health survey, and we also took the buoy GPS locations. So through all that, we finished that up. We've got the initial results today for you. They're not 100% ready to go online for the rest of the community, but we've got those initial results. And we're having our kickoff meeting. We're going to be setting goals tonight, and the consultant is going to take those goals and really start to develop the plan. So by next month, we'll have a draft plan. We'll have our second committee meeting where you'll review the plan. And then the consultant there will take your input and your kind of ideas on those recommendations from that second meeting and develop an online presentation, which we'll be sending out with a survey, an electronic survey, so people can watch from the leisure of their home all about the plan and put their input into a survey so we can get everybody's feedback that wants to provide feedback. And from there, we'll summarize those results, and working with you, hold a community meeting where we can present those results, and your group can really decide what your next steps should be. And if things go well, I think the plan is to apply for a grant in November to implement the plan. So that's where we're at and where we're headed. Let's see. So my part, I'm going to try and go through this somewhat quickly, is really to give you the results of the plant survey and a little bit just to get everybody on the same page, a bit of a management history of plants thus far. And then Tony we'll be taking it forward to get all of your ideas and facilitating that. So I know many of you already are familiar with or have heard about it, but I think one of the important things to emphasize in all of this is how important aquatic plants are to the lake. Because when you're working with invasive plants, this sometimes gets lost in the lake community, is plants are really, really important for the lake ecosystem. They're, the lakes evolved to have a well-established native plant community, and they're really important. They're good for fish. They act as a nursery for fish and food source. They're also really good for water quality. They help to filter out pollution and protect that water quality because they compete for nutrients that would otherwise grow kind of harmful algae potentially. They provide really important habitat for aquatic life, the aquatic insects that are the base of the food chain, birds, turtles, etc. They are really important for all of those species out there. But yet they don't tend to become nuisances, native plants. They can sometimes be nuisance growth, but for the most part, they do have natural controls because things evolve to adapt and eat these native plants. So in a balanced system, those native aquatic plants are super important. But as you know, there are sometimes invasive aquatic plants that can come in, and these are non-native plants, and because they're not native to this area, some certain species can really go out of control because they don't have any natural enemies, and these plants that are really successful are very adaptable and able to proliferate, and they can displace native plants, affecting that local ecology. So certain things that aquatic life uses a food source from these native plants, these invasive plants may not provide that same benefit. And they often form these large monocultures, displacing all those native plants. And they can create nuisance conditions, and that's why many of you are here tonight. They can affect swimming and boating and other things that you really love your lake and enjoy for, and can be a problem to that. We'll be talking about that. And they can be expensive to control. So there are lots of problems with native plants, and again, that's just a very brief intro to that. So the first step for any integrated aquatic vegetation management plan, as required by the state for this grant, is to do a thorough plant survey. And so there's 3 types of plants that we look for in the plant survey. We've got our shoreline plants. So we went across all the shoreline looking for the native plants as well as any of the invasives that we'll be going over. There's emergent plants. So these ones are plants that might be rooted in the water, but they float. They have floating leaves or other things that emerge to the surface. And so the big one here is going to be the lilies. And then there's submersed plants. And so these are the plants that are kind of under the water that aren't as obvious in the lake, but are super important. And this is a really classical way to group plants especially for the Department of Ecology and others, of how to think about them. And especially when we get into management, this different types of plants really going to affect how you might control or work with these plants. So on the shoreline, we actually found quite a bit of diversity of native shoreline plants, some that are really great and healthy and maybe not as common as other lakes. There was a lot of different rushes and sedges. In the lower left corner here, this one I point out, it's Douglas Spirea is a really common shoreline plant. It's got big pink flowers. I point that out a little bit because it's a lookalike for purple loosestrife, but it's just a really healthy native shrub that's common. If you're having shoreline erosion problems, this is a great plant. Actually, almost all these are. And there's another one here. Oh gosh, I forgot the common name. Tony, jump in if you can help me out there.
Which one are you pointing to?
The Marcing foil, that's what it is. This has a little red plant flowers, really pretty attractive plant that goes along with the shoreline. But what we did find about Roesiger, and this goes along with the shoreline health, most of the shoreline where people lived, there's actually little to no shoreline vegetation. So kind of a little bit separate from this topic, but that it does impact the health of the lake when there's not good, healthy shoreline plants. But we did find some invasive plants. So the ones that we have included in this integrated aquatic plan that we're addressing is purple loosestrife, which has these pink spiky flowers and are blooming right now. The maps that will show, you'll be able to see if your property has this plant. So if it does, you can go out and cut those flowers right now and prevent it from getting worse. And we'll talk about control options in the future, but you can do that today. Yellow flag iris, our most common native plant you'll see. Very showy yellow flowers, and it looks like an iris. And Japanese knotweed. Well, and I say Japanese knotweed because it's what I'm used to seeing, but there are actually several different species of knotweed that are invasive. We're not 100% sure which species these are, but these are some examples of that knotweed. So these maps will be available online and will be interactive. So this again is a draft form for you, but I had to kind of divide it up into the different basins. So here we have the South Basin and the Middle Basin. The yellow splotches are the yellow flag iris. The red dots are Japanese knotweed. And the purple stars, which on Zoom do not really show as very purple, but if you see a star, that is Japanese knotweed, or I'm sorry, purple loosestrife. So if you are in the South Basin, there was just one little purple loosestrife, but a couple Japanese knotweed scattered around. In the Middle Basin, that's where most of the purple loosestrife was found, was on the shoreline of the Middle Basin. Oh, sorry, those white dots were bottom barriers that we identified. And another one, a white dot will also represent I'll tell you that in a second. And then in the North Basin, again, knotweed was the most prevalent. There was some purple loosestrife up in the northern portion of the basin, and then a little smattering of knotweed on a few properties as well. This white dot here was a freshwater mussel, a native freshwater mussel that Christine found. So that was really cool. Mussels can live for decades, and they're a sign of good water quality and are pretty rare. So it's pretty exciting to find those, and they're really hard to find because they're really good at camouflaging themselves. So so that's the shoreline plants. If you have any questions at any point, there is a function on your bottom. You should see like an icon thing where you can raise your hand, or you can just raise your hand and hopefully one of the moderators can see you, or you can even unmute yourself and feel free to interrupt me. Just ask a question if anybody has any questions. So the next type of plant is our submersed plants. These are the ones that are growing underwater. Oh, we've got some questions. Okay. Alyssa, you want to unmute yourself?
The yellow iris, is it best to dig them out fully, or can you split them up? Like, because we've had those on our shoreline for probably 6+ years.
Yeah.
And they're pain.
they're everywhere.
How far do you have to dig down to get them out?
So just for sake of time, Tony is actually going to be talking about the management options later.
Okay.
But what we can do, Jen, maybe if you could paste in the link to the King County's Noxious Weed handout on yellow flag iris, that will be perfect.
We'll do that.
But yeah, we can definitely get into control and other things more specifically in a little bit.
Okay, great.
Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's going to be one of the key things, like if yellow flag iris, depending on what our goals are, one of our strategies is definitely going to be to get the information on how to control it out to the community. So Coleman, did you have a question?
You mean Lena?
Yes, Lena, okay. I wasn't sure if that was you or not.
Yeah, that's me. Hello. So will we be getting a copy of this presentation?
Yeah, and we plan to post the recording. So I don't know if you saw at the beginning, this is being recorded and the plan is to post it online. So anybody that was interested in what's happening in the steering community meetings can just watch it. We are happy to give a PDF version of it as well if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. And,
yep. And those maps will be made available online in both a PDF form and an interactive web map form.
oh, you mean on the new little web page? Okay, thank you so much.
Yep. Okay. So in terms of submersed aquatic plants, we did not found, there were 10 species found, but there were, most of them were, of those 5 were not very common, but 5 of these that I'm showing here are the beneficial native plants we found. There's Bladderwort, which is a carnivorous plant, and it's actually not rooted, it floats around. This was really heavy in the Middle Basin, as you'll see. There's Elodea. There were 2 different species of this found. It's one of the most common plants in the county and across the state of native plants, and this is a super important one for fish habitat. Nutella up here, and I'm going through these really fast, and I apologize, we just don't have a lot of time, is a native macroalgae. If you look out your dock, this is probably what you're going to see close to the shoreline. That's kind of growing on the inside of one of the invasives. It's kind of low to the ground and looks kind of fuzzy. This other one is water celery. It's hard to see here, but it's a thin strappy plant and it's bright green. It looks a lot like the invasive plant we're going to talk about here in a minute. And then water bulrush. This was an interesting one in the Middle Basin. It's mostly underwater, but it sends these spikes up with a tiny little flower on it. And it grows between, grows between the lilies in really dense areas. So sorry, I didn't even realize the dog was in here. Snuck in before the meeting.
Get those weeds.
Okay, the submersed plant that you probably all will recognize as being the most common one on the lake is this Slender Sagittaria. I wrote that wrong. It's supposed to say Slender Arrowhead. I'm so sorry. Sagittaria is the scientific name. Arrowhead's the common name. So Slender Arrowhead. It mostly grows underwater and has these strappy leaves, but it does have these flower stalks that stick up, and sometimes they're out of the water, sometimes they're completely submerged. And they do develop these tiny little spoon leaves if they do grow out of water. So how many people, just want to raise your hand, have seen this plant? Yeah, it's pretty much everywhere. And then invasive Eurasian water milfoil. I think most of you are familiar with this. Hopefully you haven't seen it. It's not too common in the lake anymore, but it's got a pinkish orange stalk and it's got real feathery leaves. So it does look a lot like the bladderwort. It's somewhat hard to tell apart, but if you're ever unsure, you can always take a picture and we can identify it for you. And then our last class of plants is our emergent plants. And there's 2 types that I know many of you are very familiar with, is the fragrant water lily. If you live on the Middle Basin with the pink or white flowers, there is a little bit of the native water lily too there that's yellow in the Middle Basin that you'll see. So I'm going to show you these maps. I'm not super proud of how they appear yet, but here we go. This is the North Basin. The green band is the grass-leafed arrowhead. So pretty much we saw in most of the lake, it could easily grow between 2 feet and about 7 feet deep. What this map doesn't do a good job of showing is areas where it's sparse and areas where it's dense. And this is one of the things I need to work on to improve. But it was found pretty much in every shallow area of the lake, at least in scattered small patches. Most places, especially in the South Basin and the Middle Basin, very dense. There is a little bit of white striping here in the North Basin in this location, and a couple spots along the other shore that some native plants were in high enough density that you could see them as large kind of stands. And that was of the Elodea, bladderwort, and water celery. So it was mixed in with the arrowhead, not very much native plants, not a very good coverage of native plants through most of the North Basin. There is fragrant water lilies spreading. This is the pink color. You can kind of see it coming from the middle basin up the shoreline. This is about the northern extent of it. It's right about here in the basin. So it's definitely making its way further north progressively. And then lastly, the divers that were hired by your community did find some Eurasian water milfoil in the cove in the North Basin, and to my understanding pulled that. So hopefully it's not there anymore. So that was exciting. And then the middle basin is where it gets really colorful. The green area is the Slender Arrowhead, and it is really found throughout the entire middle of the basin. There's just a few small areas that didn't have any native plants, but it is dense, very dense growth through much of this area, and that's green. There was a small patch of milfoil found that the divers also pulled this year. And then the pink is fragrant water lily. We did have some surprise there in the fragrant water lily, as there was native plants growing in there. So their water bulrush and bladderwort were growing in some areas quite densely, either between the lilies or any space that was kind of open where there were no lilies. So that was encouraging that some native plants are actually holding their own amongst those lilies. So if we did eradicate those lilies, perhaps those native plants would continue to thrive there. And these orange patches are quite small, but those are the native yellow water lily. There's just a few patches here and there of those, but the majority is the fragrant water lily. Oh, where did my North Lake get covered up? Or my South Basin? I will just pull that in and reshare here quickly. Sorry about that. Okay. So hopefully, can you see this map now of the South Basin? Okay, sorry about that. This is the South Basin. It looks very much like the North Basin, except the Sagittaria is denser, mostly because there's areas that are shallower out further. So for example, over by the park, Sagittaria goes quite a bit further out just because the lake is shallower further out. There's a couple areas where there's some native plants here annotated by the white. And we did find some milfoil in the South Basin in our visual survey that the divers did not pull this year. There's this offshore area there. Sorry. So sorry. Dog is gone. Yeah, that's it for the South Basin. So yeah, and there was one tiny little milfoil plant over here we found too. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation. Okay, my last thing, and are we doing okay on time, Shannon? Okay. So the last thing that my role is to just share the history of what's happened thus far. I know a lot more about the milfoil control history. So in the 90s is when milfoil was first identified. And that same year, Surface Water Management at the county applied for an early infestation grant. And there were—
Marissa, you need to share your screen again.
Oh. Okay, hang on.
It was there and went away.
Okay, is it back?
It's back.
Thank you for jumping in, whoever that was. I didn't see or hear who that was. Okay, so back in the 90s, we applied for the grant and immediately were able to do 6 days of diver hand pulling that year. And so that was great. It really cut it down. And then for the next 6 years, there was 2 to 3 days of diver hand pulling that the county funded, and it was able to eliminate large patches. So pretty much the large stands of milfoil were gone, because when it was first identified, I should have said it was found throughout all the basins, but there were some particular hotspots in the north and the middle, or in the south and the middle basin. Through 2005 through 2011, there were lower levels of milfoil, so the county cut back. Oh, I'm sorry, that was 5 to 6 days in 99, geez. But we cut back to 2 to 3 days in 2005. And then 2011, there were some regulatory diving changes, which doubled or tripled our diving costs. So we were only able to do 1 day of diving per year. And then in 2018, swim went through some significant budget cuts because we had a budget shortfall. And one of the things that was cut was diving. So the Roesiger Community Club stepped in 2019 to hire divers to hand pull it. And they hired them in 2019. They pulled the South and the Middle Basins. In 2021, the North. And I don't know if they did the whole Middle Basin or just that North end, but they definitely pulled there. So it's kind of astonishing that the Milfoil has gotten down to such a low level over the years through hand pulling. And it's exciting so that it's at such a low level right now because most lakes it doesn't go that way. The diver hand pulling usually isn't able to keep up and it explodes into large populations as we've seen on Lake Goodwin and Lake Shucraft that we've been working on with them for 20 years or so on the same type of plant. The last thing was our lily control history. And unfortunately, I know Melanie provided an amazing summary of all the work the community club has done on lily control work to date. And when I went to pull that up, that link no longer worked. So I could not populate this slide very well. So if Melanie, if you could reshare that, but I can briefly tell you a little bit about the lily control work. And I think this group is probably more aware of it, but we'd like to get this right in the plan when we write it up. But the lilies have been there for decades. The aerial photos show it's been there for a long time. So they've just continued to grow. They were probably planted ornamentally as an attractive plant and have since exploded over the decades and have continued to grow and expand. And so I know there was some initial work and ideas to do some herbicide treatments, especially in the Middle Basin. There were some original meetings and communications about that. And then some landowners wished to pursue that and began, but there were some problems with the applicator not following the correct permit process, which that kind of ended in its tracks. And since then, the community club I know has done a ton of work to try and provide alternative options, such as hand tools and bottom barriers and getting the permitting for that. So I think you know more about that, so I'm not going to go into it further. And all of your actions really to date has led us to be here today. So thank you for all of your work and advocacy for the lake. So on that note, I am going to turn it over to Tony.
Thank you. Can you actually go back one more slide? So I thought it would be good, this will go into the plans. You don't need to read all of this, but I thought it might be good to kind of go over some of the sort of broad categories of the types of controls so that we're all kind of speaking the same language. So when I say something like a manual control method, usually that involves your hands, your hand pulling, you're using a rake, you're using some kind of a cutting device, and that's either as a landowner or maybe a contracted diver. And then a chemical, I think we all intuitively know that's an EPA and ecology approved aquatic herbicide. Mechanical involves some type of machine, and there's all kinds of things that are out there. I've seen some pretty interesting homegrown mechanical apparatuses, if you will. So there's some pretty diverse appliances, if you will, on the market to cover the mechanical. Harvesters generally mean, just as it sounds, it not only cuts the weed, but it removes it, but there are also a number of cutters. So they'll cut the plant, but then not remove it from the system. And for some folks, that's fine. If they just want to say clear a ski lane and their lake is filled to the top, that might be perfectly fine for them. But for most of us, we'd want to see that plant material removed. Dredging usually involves some type of specialized equipment that will hopefully remove the plants. And again, you can have a diver that assists in this. We have a couple of projects where there's equipment up on a barge. There's a diver operating a handheld dredge underwater to sort of suck mostly the plants up, because you have eyes on it, so you can separate the plants a little bit better. But there are also ones that just kind of, it's just dredging in the classic sense. And bottom barriers, I heard some mention of that. So you mentioned, Marissa, that there were some hot spots that you found when you're doing the survey of these barriers, and we typically recommend using a burlap because it will decompose over time, but there's also geotextiles and plastics that have been used, and there's any number of ways of doing this, but basically provide shade, just like you might in a garden, to crowd out or to shade out and limit light for plants. And then biological controls, these are usually, people think of an insect, but there's also grass carp, sterile or infertile triploid grass carp. And the reason I kind of want to bring these up, I don't want to drill down to the specifics of any one of these, but I just want to make sure we're kind of, again, talking about the same language. And when I talk about some of the plants that Marissa's already talked about and a little bit more information about the management options, one thing I want to kind of bring out and maybe start thinking about is not any one of these will fit all plants and vice versa. They're all going to kind of have, not just for your lake, but in any situation. For example, if your objective is to eradicate milfoil, you wouldn't want to go out there with some kind of a harvester because the nature of the way the plant spreads. And that's kind of what I want to get to in the next slides. So go ahead, Marissa. And so with each of the plant slides that I'm going to go over, well, let me back up. I left out the general impacts. You all live on the lake. You've seen the problems that they create. I think that if you have any questions about these, we can drill down into a little bit deeper. But, you know, I found myself writing this for every single plant, and I thought, well, I'll just take it out and put it on one slide. Because we typically see the dense mats. You see that every time you look at the lake. It impedes a lot of recreation, swimming and boating. They crowd out and displace the native beneficial plants. It can cause direct and indirect impacts to other aquatic life, indirect in that it can disrupt, for example, the dissolved oxygen in the water column. So you can get very high levels at the surface, which sounds good, but if you have super saturated water, or DO in that sense, you also can get elevated water temperatures. Well, then you can get very low DO below because you're not getting that mixing. So it's not a direct toxin to a fish, but it obviously impacts their environment. So again, with each plant, I wanted to kind of touch on that within each key plant, kind of how it spreads, and then just again, an overview of potential management options. And then I've kind of put this little triangle symbol, because in my mind, these are ones that we will probably consider for the plan. It doesn't make sense to evaluate every type of control for all of these plants because they simply are not applicable to some of them. So I have sort of used best professional judgment and experience. Harry and I have talked quite a bit about this and listened to Marissa about what's been tried at the lake already, trying to sort of flesh out what might make sense for each plant. So, and then there's a web link down here. The county has some really great information on their website, so I'm giving them a little plug. Next slide. So purple loosestrife, typically these are rooted in or near the water. They need to have their feet wet, so to speak. They often are in quite dense stands, and they spread by seed and stem and the root fragments. Again, they tend to crowd out other plants. And Marissa mentioned this could also be mistaken for Spirea or fireweed, which is, you have to look pretty closely from far away, and it's real easy to mix them up. So a few of the management, so the way this section is laid out is going to be the same for each of the plants. So in this case, the first two are potential management options for this plant at the lake. Manual digging. Sorry, you guys can hear that. But with this plant and many, you have to remove all of the material. So if you go out there and you start, I think Marissa, you mentioned this is a good time of year to start clipping flowers. That's great, but you want to make sure and get all of the flowers. You don't want to leave them. You're not composting. You're not doing anything good for the environment by leaving those on the ground. You want to get anything out that you cut. There are chemical options available for this plant. Mechanical is really, it falls in that category of probably not going to be recommended. You don't want to create fragments or anything with this one. Dredging, this one's more of a shoreline, so it's not terribly applicable. A bottom barrier in this case, I think that's a term usually used for more of a submersed plant. I suppose you could cut this back and shade it out as an option, but bottom barrier typically refers to a submersed plant. And as far as a biological control, I should have a little arrow on that because there are biological control agents, in this case, a couple of species of beetles that target different life stages of the plant in different parts of the plant. But each beetle sort of attacks different parts of the plant.
And Tony, I'm not sure, but I think that there may be some history of beetle release by the lake community. Is anybody aware of that? I suspect it was with Elsie Sorgenfree. but I
Yeah.
can't confirm that anymore. So I think there has been some work by beetles in the past, and that's probably why it's not as bad as it could
Yeah,
be.
it was by Elsie. She was her neighbor. And the one thing that I know some of the people got upset about was that the beetles got in and chewed up other plants that apparently were also good for the lake. So, but I don't know what they were. It was a long time ago.
That's good to know. Next slide, please. And so yellow flag iris. This one is, I remember somebody telling me sometime, if you ever see a really pretty something yellow on a lake, it's yellow flag iris, and it's turned out to be true, and it's really a difficult one to control. And again, this is one that if you can get out and start cutting back some flowers, that could start giving you a little ground, but you need to be aware that it does create a resin that can be harmful to your skin, so you want to protect yourself with that. And I think you attached the King County flyer, right? Yeah, so that's again something that you could probably start doing sooner rather than later, is cutting back some plants like this. This plant, especially before it forms its beautiful yellow flower, can easily be confused with a native cattail. And Marissa, I didn't see that on too much on your list. Is that very common around the lake, cattails?
Not at all. There was just a couple small stands, and the cattails were definitely much taller. They were definitely mixed in with iris though. So if you're not sure, I mean, this time of year you'll actually see the cattail. It's a good time to go look so you can see which one's which.
So with this one, I think we were just talking about, some hand pulling. Again, you have to remove all the plant parts, especially that rhizome, which is not going to go away easily. Repeated year after year of cutting back is what's going to be needed for this one. And there are chemical choices. I don't know that we'll be looking too much at any kind of mechanical or dredging or barriers for this one. And there are no known biological control agents for yellow flag iris at this time. So next slide. The invasive knotweeds. Marissa mentioned there's a group of knotweeds and they hybridize, and there's a bit of you could see a different genus species name if you're looking in that way, because it's been kind of renamed. So don't be surprised if you see that. This one also, it's a common thing with a lot of these invasives to spread by fragments, and the rhizomes are the horizontal roots, and in this case seed. But it's very common for a lot of non-natives to spread in this way by the fragments. And like a lot of these other, it limits the amount of ground that's underneath the stand for other plants, and so it can result in some erosion problems, which ironically, some of these plants too, like a couple of other plants, I'm escaping me right now, were intentionally planted years ago for erosion control. I'm not saying that knotweed necessarily was, but it's kind of ironic that it doesn't really turn out to always be that way. In this case, there's a manual option. There almost always is, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of removal of the plant material. There are chemical options for this particular species. Not looking probably at mechanical or dredging, but we could probably consider using some covers on this if it's cut back. And
Allison has a question when you have a second.
oh, sorry, it's hard for me to see that. Go ahead, Allison.
Sorry, I'm curious. That's that Japanese loosestrife. Have you guys worked with the Japanese loosestrife that's on the way to Monroe from Lake Roesiger? It's down on just past Yeager Road on Woods Creek Road. The entire hillside's covered with it, and I'm wondering because it looks like they've been trying to eradicate that for years.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure where you're talking about in particular. Japanese knotweed is so widespread that the Noxious Weed Control Board can't address it all. So the efforts have been concentrated when we've been able to receive grants for stream and river restoration projects, because it does affect salmon habitat in those areas, and so that's where we've been able to get funding. So there's been quite a bit of effort done on that, but probably not. If it's on private property, it's probably hasn't anything been done. If it's in a road right away, it's possible the Noxious Weed Control Board has been on it, but you can certainly report it to them. But if it's not in our county property or it's not part of a grant on a focused kind of ecological protection.
I'm just wondering, because it's such a huge area, that I'm wondering if something had been done that we could learn from. So, because they've covered it, they've poisoned it, they've,
Yeah, we have lots of expertise and experience on the best ways to kill this, though, for sure. King County especially has done some amazing trainings on this for individual landowners. But yeah, our noxious weed control team has really good advice and other things on how to deal with this. One thing I've been trying to do, and this is one thing I was going to bring up when we start talking about next steps, is I think we've had some emails about this, is whether the Noxious Weed Control Board would be willing to do treatments on these lakefront properties as part of this plan. I haven't gotten a definitive answer on that yet. It really depends on their capacity, but I'm hoping that's something we can do. And now that we've got them mapped out.
Our neighbor would definitely be up for it. He's got it at the top of the property, right up against one of the main streams that comes into the lake, and then right down on the lake too. Huge pad.
Yeah,
So,
it'd be a great one, but I haven't gotten that for sure. So we can talk more about that hopefully here in next steps.
Awesome. Yeah, and you bring up a good point, Marissa. If the group may or may not be aware of this, but the way the Noxious Weed Board classifies these weeds has a lot to do also with why some of these are listed here, because like Marissa mentioned, even though this is really widespread, the state looks at it a little bit differently because it's where it's growing in a riparian area. So, and that can play down the road in how you get funding and what the priorities are as well. So, next slide. So this is the Slender Arrowhead that Marissa mentioned that is so widespread around the lake, and I found this one quite interesting because it's not a common invasive plant, and there's only found in the 5 lakes in Washington State. And I imagine this could easily get confused with the tape grass or Vallisneria, as Marissa mentioned, which is not particularly problematic. It's not considered native in some places, but typically isn't even problematic if it were. But this one also spreads by rhizomes and tubers, but also by seed. So lots of different options for this one. And I even read recently that the seeds can pass through ducts after ingestion, which is also not too uncommon. But you know, a lot of aquatic plants, they're not big seed producers because it's just not a mechanism they relied on for reproduction. But in this case, it's quite a hardy producer. And in fact, the seeds can float for weeks before they sink and germinate, which this is common with a lot of other plant parts with aquatic plants. I did a study once with Milfoil and Brazilian Eladia, where I let stems float for 12 weeks and they survived. And you can imagine how far a plant fragment can go if it's floating for 12 weeks in a lake. We're looking into options for this one because it's not a big problem in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of the information that we're gleaning from this really comes from other Sagittarius species. And in fact, I haven't found an aquatic herbicide label that specifically lists this Graminia species on it. So we have a little bit more homework to do on this one to see if that's an option, but there is still the manual, potentially chemical, as I mentioned, and dredging is an option, not a cheap investment, but an option, and bottom barriers and no biological controls. It's probably not even being researched at this point, although this is a problematic plant in Australia. So they could be doing, I think they might be ahead of the curve on finding products and potentially insects to control. Next slide. Milfoil. I think it's great that this lake has been targeted for some milfoil hand removal. It sounds like a borderline success story for that. You know, at this point, you may be looking at a potential ability to eradicate this plant from the lake, which would be great. This one easily grows from fragments. A lot of people think, oh, if it gets really cold in the water, it won't make it. But I've seen this plant grow in dewatered portions of a reservoir in Montana, and it did just fine when the water came up in the spring. So don't let anybody tell you it'll be cold and it'll be icy because it grows all over Minnesota. So one problem with this plant is it really easily hybridizes with a native northern milfoil. And the picture in the middle there is showing how hard it can be to differentiate between the northern, the Eurasian, and the hybrid especially. And you end up relying on DNA analysis for that. And that's important because if you end up with a hybrid, there have been many, many cases, especially in northern Idaho, of showing herbicide resistance. So some lakes that have been studied recently, they've been doing some DNA work first do, say, an herbicide treatment. If that treatment is unsuccessful, where it normally in other places has been, they might do a DNA analysis and then try another tool in the toolbox, a different herbicide. Because the beauty of this one, if you will, is that there are a number of herbicides that are available that will target milfoil. And then again, back to the management, there's definitely manual. You guys have demonstrated that one. Not so much mechanical, because again, this is a plant that easily fragments. I would not recommend mechanical. Dredging using diver-assisted hand pulling is great. I think barriers to some degree. Did you mention, Marissa, that this is being used on the lake now?
That's for lilies, not for milfoil.
So one of the issues with the barriers for this one is it can really poke out the sides and kind of seep out the edges. So with milfoil, so it's a small scale option. And I forgot my little triangle again. We have to clean up our slides, I think. There are biological control agents approved for milfoil. I maybe didn't put it on here because I don't know that it would be appropriate to this lake in this situation, but they are available. So I think that's it for that slide. And our friend Fragrant water lily. Again, this one spreads by floating seeds and rhizomes. And these seeds can further spread through wind and waves. And one of the concerns for the middle basin is this, as the plant grows, it locks in sediment, leads to what we would refer to as sediment accretion or sediment buildup. And I kind of poached this photo in the bottom left. I don't know, Marissa, if that was the intent of yours and Jen's photo, but that's what that appears to be to me, is buildup of sediment. And then this fellow on the bottom right is holding up a huge pile of fragrant water lily with the enormous rhizome. So you can imagine if any part of this releases how much, all of that is filled like, think of a potato, it's all this carbohydrate reserve. So if you get any breaks from these rhizomes, you have tremendous capacity for spread. Next slide. I'll go back one more. Actually, Marissa mentioned that it can be confused with your native spatterdock, so I won't belabor that point. Management for this one, definitely repeated cutting. Dig out the rhizome, cut flowers, always remove all the parts that you possibly can. There are chemical options for this. Potentially for diver-assisted dredging, diver suction dredge, sorry, or traditional dredging. And you mentioned bottom barriers, so we can definitely explore some of these other options. This is just sort of a first cut of what might be available to for these different species. And before I move out, I meant to invite Harry Gibbons from Tetra Tech to see if he wanted to chime in on any of these management options. I didn't intend for this to be recommendations, just more of an illustration of how one shoe doesn't fit all. So
I think you've covered it very well as an overview, and there's specifics that we'll kind of dive into more as we move forward. But for today, this is a good oversight and some of the realistic limitations. And one of the limitations on things that you brought up is costs and effectiveness. So the other is how long is it going to take for some things like barriers? For some plants, the barriers is, 4 years to 6 years, you really see eradication in that area. And some places it's a 12 to 16 year period before you see the success. So barriers have to be repeated and they have to be cleaned, otherwise they don't work. So particularly for things like the lily. That's it. You did great.
Thanks, Harry. Let's see, next slide. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to kind of throw all this information at you, why are natives good, why are invasives bad, what's out there, where was it mapped, kind of an overview of what you may or may not be able to do for each species, but we want to hear from you. And we thought, given it's not a huge group of people, but maybe a good way to kind of get this information out is to use this one of these whiteboards. So it's if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a system where you can sort of take your thought put it in a little sticky note, and it'll show up on a screen, and we'll show you that in a second. And so the first part of what we'll do is to everybody think about what you see as the problem or problems. I kind of don't want to give you any ideas because I know you have your own or you wouldn't be here. So maybe think of maybe 3 of those, and you know, keep in mind that other people are going to have similar feelings. So if, for example, one is it impacts my swimming, you know, if you see that one pop up, maybe don't waste your sticky on that one unless you just feel really strongly about it. But so we'll go through and first do the identifying some problems, talk about some goals, and then give you a chance to have some additional considerations or concerns. So let me get that back up, kind of walk you through.
So while we're waiting for Marissa's screen to come back, in the chat box of the Zoom meeting, Marissa shared the Jamboard, which is the digital whiteboard program. She shared the link. So if you all can click on that link, you should be able to, it'll take you to a website. And then that is where you can click on that. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see kind of like a ribbon bar or a menu bar, and this sticky note is like the little white box that's got a couple of lines, and so you can click on that and add it to the Jamboard. Or if you're having troubles, you can type what you would like in your sticky in the Zoom chat, and I can go ahead and put it in the Jamboard for you. So either way works for us, whatever works best for all of you.
Marissa, maybe you want to do one since they can see your screen and see exactly where to pick the right button. And then once we start kind of compiling a few of these, we can group them together and kind of start painting a picture of what you all see as problems.
Okay, so if you can see this, you just click on the sticky note. You can pick a color, whichever you want, and write something. And if you hit save, it'll add it to the board. And if you're not sure how to do that or can't do the link, just put it in the chat and Jen will, or Shannon will add it for you.
And the idea with this is that part of the Citizens Manual for developing this plan is to come up with a very clear problem statement. And this problem statement gets used for future grants, for your permits, as something probably to communicate with the larger community. So you kind of, the idea here is to get as many of your thoughts out, and then we'll take that and hopefully develop a problem statement that you all can revisit and see if you agree with. And we'll do the same with the goals. But I want to sort of point out the value of having a really tight and succinct problem statement.
So if somebody's got 2 people at least have figured out how to use it. If you're still struggling and have any questions, raise your hand. Christine, you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, I think my computer launched Firefox and my it's just spinning. I'm not.
Oh, okay. So you could try copying and pasting it into a different thing, or you can just put it into the chat and Shannon will add it to the Jamboard for you.
Okay, and I can't even see my chat screen right now, but okay. Okay.
Or you can just say it out loud and we can add it for you.
All right, I'll see what I can do first here.
The chat disappeared for me also, and I'm having trouble figuring out the sticky note thing. So I'm in the same situation.
Okay, so on your chat, if you go to your view, or you might be able to change your view If you're in full screen mode, you could press escape, that might help. You might be in full screen mode and that's making it hard for you to do it. Or like I said, you can just say it out loud and we can write it up for you if this is getting frustrating.
Or does your my mute, stop video, security, and participants and chat all disappear after a while? If you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, does it pop up? Kind of like above your toolbar?
Yeah, I found mine.
Oh, good.
So, and to clarify, the purpose of this board is specifically problems with invasive plants. So all of you are representatives on the Lake Basin. What do you think the invasive plants for the perception of lake residents are issues are you having? So this isn't, I see there's a couple questions about herbicides and other concerns. Those are good things. We're gonna be, having an area kind of for other concerns, but try and have these comments focused on what types of problems invasive plants are causing for you.
My system seems to be jammed up, but I'll offer at least one comment. Just one thing as a lake monitor, Marissa, that you provided me was a map of Lake Roesiger with contour depth lines. And I recently took that out because I wanted to go to the middle lake to take some temperature and dissolved oxygen readings. And I see that the map that was provided is, the contour bathymetry is from 1952, but it shows in the middle lake maximum depth of 10 feet, kind of in the middle part of the channel of the middle basin. And when I went out there to try to take some measurements, I dropped actually my Secchi disc in as well to see if I could measure water transparency, but I did it in about 4 different locations, and the deepest depth I could get was just under 2 meters. So I don't know if there's been any updates to the bathymetry map, but to me, I mean, I didn't do any kind of comprehensive survey, but at least in the few places where I measured, it seems to suggest that that middle basin has filled in quite a bit from the 10 feet from, well, this would be 70 years ago. But again, I could only get just under 2 feet maximum depth. I mean, 2 meters, or about just over 6 feet. So I think navigation and the extent of the Lilly pad coverage in terms of density and surface area is really significant in the middle lake. And without aggressively looking at that issue, we, years down the way, might be choking off the north and south basins from each other.
Is there anybody else that wants to verbally share things that are having, that this might not be the best tool for? Alina?
Yeah, I can't put anything anywhere. I just see these examples of sticky notes and everywhere, but I live on the middle lake and we have feet and feet of sediment. You can't even begin to pull anything. So, my thoughts and theories are that we begin spraying them. So that's.
And we're going to be talking about control options more later. So, but you cut out a little bit. I heard you said something feet of sediment. What was that?
We have feet and feet of sediment.
Oh, feet and feet and feet. Okay.
Out there. It stinks. It's nasty. You can't even get there. So there has to be some kind of being able to dredge and pull some of that out a little bit, or to just at least begin spraying them so that we don't have so much sediment. You know, it'll be past my lifetime, but you know, it's. I'd like to look at a clear lake and be able to enjoy my waterfront property, but you know. Anyway, thank you.
All right. Okay. Okay, so Lena, I put a couple sticky notes in there. I put water clarity, ability to enjoy property, and sediment problems.
Did anyone capture Melanie's comment in the chat about lily pads?
Yep.
Okay. This is great. This is exactly what I was hoping would happen.
I can add that, you know, the sediment in the bottom of the lake isn't new. You know, I'm 40 years old, and when I was little, it was a gunky mess at the bottom of the middle lake because my aunt's father's and mother's property is on the middle lake, and it, I guarantee, has increased, and we want to stop it from increasing. But the problem is when the lily pads, if we, you know, when they die, all that yuckiness goes to the bottom, and it'd be so much better to be able to take it out. But yeah, I've been swimming with the lily pads, you know, most of my life. So I just want to voice that I agree with Lena that it's gotten out of control, that it needs to be taken out, but I'm just not sure about spraying. I'm worried about spraying it because then all of that new, like, because spray, you know, it has to be added year after year after year. And so I want to voice that it's not a, you know, one and done process. And I've learned that through Marissa. And so I'm worried about that much more, you know, base sediment that we're going to incur before we actually get rid of the lily pads. And I just want to voice that I'm not set on anything, but I think we have to have multiple options, whether it be removal or spraying. I think that both of those options could be in the realm when we finish the process to be voted on.
Mm-hmm. And you know, I think you bring up a very long-term perspective that's important to make very clear, because you're right, decay of all of the lilies especially would be a problem, and how you manage that biomass is really important, not just for in-season treatment, but for down the road. And I think that what I'm seeing on the board and I'm hearing from folks is, you know, making sure that that's part of our evaluation is what that story could look like, but both in terms of how it could happen and how it would play out, and would it be worth the effort on all levels. So this is great. I think that we should maybe move over to the goals.
So Tony, so can I ask you, yeah, what do you mean that this would be long term?
Well, I guess when I was commenting about it's Alyssa, is that right?
Lena.
Yes.
Is, you know, one in-season herbicide application for something like lilies is not going to be the solution, because you have all this biomass. So I'm thinking we need to be looking down the road, like, okay, so there's some management that occurs in, say, year one. What does that look like in year two and year three? You know, one thing in the past when we've done these plans, we've thought about, like, okay, what's realistic, say, in the near term, 3 to 5 years versus, you know, what's down the road, because some of these management options are going to be very large investments that won't be able to happen right away. And they might not make sense right away, but maybe they would down the road. So I don't know if that answers your question. I guess I'm
and what Marissa had pointed out earlier when all of this first started is it could be up to a 10-year process with the spring.
Depending on the plant and the management tool that's selected, I don't think we can expect to have any kind of long-term management potentially after just this one thing. Just like I wish I had that with dandelions in my yard. I'm always saying that. If I could get rid of dandelions in 1 year, I'd have my landscape people be out of work. But you know, I think that we just have to sort of look at it through that similar lens. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I feel like that was you were just looking down the road. I think that's important to think about.
So Tony,
well, I do believe that there will have to have some sort of a dredging mechanism to clear out all the muck as well. Because, like I said, there's feet and feet of muck, you know, that accumulated, and you know, you go in over your head in the muck. So I think there's going to have to be some sort of a dredging mechanism along with removing them.
Right, and I think that gets to I mean, that fits into the problem. I think I'm seeing a lot of input here about the depth of the muck for sure.
Tony, before we go on, I think that these have been grouped up. Before we go on, I think we should maybe just pause a second and see if there's anything missing, go over the themes and maybe see what's missing real quick. Would that make sense? Shannon, are you the one that's been shuffleboarding them? Or is that Jen?
I have not been shuffleboarding them. Occasionally I'll move them around to just make sure there's not one underneath of one.
Okay, well, it does seem, I don't know if this
It's
is
been
done.
me.
Who is that? Is that Brian? Oh, Lonnie. So
It's
it looks
me.
like, Lonnie, it looks like you've grouped them, if I'm looking at it right. And the ones to the left mostly are doing with sediment filling into the lakes and the muck buildup and choking out. So that's one theme. It looks like you've got a theme of lily pads and navigation. And then there's a couple other ones. There's a couple here about herbicides. It seems like that's a different concern that's emerging. And then a few random one-offs, kind of like ability to enjoy property, water clarity, and spreading to other lakes and preventing spread of new ones. Is what I'm seeing is, so I don't know if this is a point to see if anything is missing.
One problem that I'm not seeing, and maybe it's just because I'm not reading fast enough, that has come up with other lakes in these management plans is the impacts to recreation, boating, kayaking, paddleboarding. Is that is that not an issue at this lake?
That was an issue. That was initially why the first when the first company that wanted to spray didn't follow through with the permits correctly and didn't notify lake members. That is why it got shut down, is because we didn't have enough notification. And you know, families are out on their lake, they're out on their vacation property. So that was one of the main reasons why it got shut down initially. When I'm not sure who started it, but when the first process of spraying on the middle lake got all of this started, that's initially why it happened, was because people were out with their families on the lake and they said, you know, stay out of the lake for, you know, a week.
And that company was Aquatic. So they would be the company that would spray if it ever occurs. So it was Aquatic, and they made a mistake, but they spray lots of lakes based on recommendations. And so, you know, They made a mistake.
Yes, I agree. Aquatic, they said full-heartedly they took, you know, total ownership of their mistake. They sent out, you know, cards saying sorry kind of thing, and but I guess they had some new workers that didn't know, you know, how to send out the right things. I don't know, but they did apologize and shut down the process. So nothing against the company.
What about any concerns over water quality? I mean, I see water clarity. Has that been, I'm like Shannon, this is a lot to take in. Is there concern over the impacts to water quality or taste, or not taste, but odor problems?
Yeah.
Harmful algae blooms. Are there any concerns on that front?
I think that's what initiated, you know, the uproar about the spraying was water quality, you know, frogs and fishes that nest under the lily pads and whatnot. That was one of the first outcries that I heard. I don't know if anyone else heard anything. I'll let someone else speak.
I'll point out, this is Ron, I'll point out that in the 2019, was it, report for milfoil removal, they mentioned that they couldn't get to or remove some of the milfoil because the muck was stirred up so much their divers couldn't even see.
And it's too shallow.
And it looks like Lonnie has a question.
Yeah.
Lonnie, go ahead.
One of the things with the muck, it stinks. People complain about that. Over by the park, if you stir it up, it stinks because that's where one of the places the lily pads are starting to take root in the South Basin. And so the muck, I went in there by the park and I sunk up to my waist. So that's actually in the shallow side of the South Basin. So, and it stinks pretty bad. So that's one of the issues with the muck. But removing it is a huge cost, and just killing everything off and letting that stuff go into the South Basin, we're gonna have such a large fish kill off and aquatic life kill off that, and it'll just keep going out the end of the lake and into the creeks, and it'll be a huge issue. So it's not something we can just kill everything and let it go.
Yeah, I agree. I think in the sense of time, because Shannon just pinged me that we're getting there.
We do have one more hand up, Tony.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Alex has his hand up.
Sorry.
Hello. I was just wondering if muck pellets have been effective in other projects. Are you familiar with those?
Let me just summarize a couple things on muck and what you can do, the options we have to consider. Last century, a long time ago, I used hydrogen peroxide in drinking water reservoirs in California to oxygenate the sediment and burn up the organics. That was before hydrogen peroxide was permitted by EPA as a herbicide. So you could use pellet forms that were highly concentrated, and we essentially oxygenated the sediment and burned up all the organics and created a whole different environment for a drinking water reservoir. That's not allowed anymore. So the other option is like dredging, because hydrogen peroxide is now a licensed herbicide, so its level of application is controlled in terms of concentration. Dredging is an option, but like you mentioned, it's extremely expensive. An average 30 acre removal, for instance, is about $35 million. So, and you've got a lot of depth, a lot of stuff to do. So the cost is way up there. The other kind of way to work with it over time in some areas, not like shoreline areas around docks and stuff, is where you use bottom barriers like burlap with sand filled bags or some pea gravel filled bags to hold down the bottom barrier. And as that rots and you replace those bags, what that does is it condenses the organic material and settles it down and changes the oxygen transfer from the water to the bottom, because you don't have the plants anymore adding organic material. So eventually, a lot of that organic material that's easily oxidized and using up all the oxygen, so it stinks, is neutralized, and you compress the sediment also with the sand and the thing. So that's a long-term solution that's more cost affordable, but it's not going to happen in a one-shot deal. It takes many years. So those are things we'll get into in the plan a little bit in terms of discussion because of the problems. But those are just some perspectives that put a limit on it. We used to have some tools that really worked, but those tools aren't available to us. But there are other tools, but then you got to consider cost and time frame to get there.
So how many acres of lilygats do we have? It's been estimated at 26 acres or so. Bottom barriers aren't going to take care of 26 acres of lilygats.
Now, I don't know the total estimate at this point. We're getting to that as the maps get refined, so that's something we'll have to calculate. The other thing is the depth. Are we talking about a cubic yard, so 3 feet deep, or are we talking about 2 cubic yards to remove, or in some places 3? All that adds to that cost, so it's not just the area.
Yeah.
Also, I'd like to add. I'd like to add that we have started using the bottom barriers in the channels to keep them open. And there's been at least one other resident, maybe 2, that have taken up to put up bottom barriers around their docks and joined our insurance plan that we have through the community club. So there are a couple people that have done the bottom barriers, and we just laid them, and they are keeping the channel on between the south and the middle lake open.
Yeah, bottom barriers are an option that we're going to be talking about and putting out there for everyone to think about. And like I said, again, if you're using the burlap and you use the full burlap bags, it does condense, it does give you a long-term treatment, and it does, limit the plants and do that. So you also, just as a point, every shoreline resident that has a shoreline access can lay up to a half inch of burlap bottom without a permit. That's on the permit that's on the internet, so you don't have to have a formal permit, so there's no cost. So that is an annual thing that you can do, no more than half an acre, but that's every resident does a little bit. That's going to help
us. We have actually paid for the permits for the whole Middle Lake if they want to join.
That's because it's a larger area and you have to get.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that you can encourage, and in other lakes we've encouraged, different programs, interactive between organizations and stuff, so that they can reduce the cost of the burlap and have it stored places. So
exactly, yes.
And they burp up and make big messes that you have to invest in more sand bags to throw out there to get the big burps to come down. So I'm watching my neighbors, they have a huge burp. They've had to throw out more sandbags and then it's a mess.
Do we have any more hands up? Because I think we probably want to move to the goals. I think we're getting a lot of really good information here that we can build the problem statement from.
You got one more hand up.
Got another hand, sorry. Go for it.
Hi, I was just wondering if Marissa had viewed that proposal that I had last year of getting a diver-assisted suction harvester or creating one and basically accumulating or pumping all the sediment and vegetation through nets and pulling out the vegetation and leaving the sediment in a confined area to introduce muck pellets, which would be like microbial matter to like help decay and accelerate the decaying process. What were your thoughts on that?
So, Alex, I'll talk about the first part and I'm going to let Harry talk about the muck pellets. Yes, your proposal, definitely diver section dredging in terms of the, I mean, that is one of the options that you look at. There's different ways to look at it. The diver section dredging is where you, it can be done a couple ways, but typically with lilies, to my understanding, is the best option is to cut out the tubers, then suck up the material. There actually is a person on the lake. I think you've probably seen the Lily Slayer boat that has been actually developing their own diver section dredge and is been testing that out. That could, it's definitely going to be something that's considered in the plan, and I've provided that contact information to Tetra Tech to explore with them. There are also companies, he's been working with companies across the country, so that is an option. It doesn't reduce the muck much though. It's the whole idea is to not pick up much muck with it, because the big expense of dredging is the removal, dewatering and removal is my understanding at least. But the pellets, I'll let Harry talk about those.
Well, the trouble with the pellets is that you're dealing with muck that already has the bacteria and enzymes already there that the pellets are adding, and that the oxygen supply and getting the oxygen there without laying down aeration lines, it's not a quick action. So on a large scale, we haven't seen that positive results for that sort of thing. So, you know, it's there, but I need a little more scientific, independent documentation that it actually provides the benefit. Just because we, on a larger scale, and that has been studied and stuff, we just haven't seen it. I'm hoping for new tools. I'd like to see some new things work, but those type things have been floating around for a while, and most of them just haven't held the water when tested independently on a larger scale. Now, one thing to do is if you did diver dredging and you sorted through and you had the weeds and pulled the weeds out and the muck went back to the bottom, if you also had aeration lines that you were injecting oxygen into the air, into the sediment, that would increase the decay because you've already got the bacteria and fungus that's going to take it off and run with it. It's already there. But the oxygen's the deficient factor. Because the organic layer is needs much more oxygen than what can diffuse through passive diffusion.
And I should say, Alex, that you've done an incredible amount of work and research, you and others like Melanie, into this topic, and it's really impressive in terms of your community, you know, member of the level of that. And so if there is something we're missing in the draft plan that you feel like needs to be explored further, or you've, you know, definitely put that out, because I've just been super impressed by all the work you've done and others have done at this lake.
One question, Harry, you're from Aquatic?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Harry, you are from Aquatic?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so is Tony from Aquatic?
No, nobody on the call is from
Nobody
Aquatic.
is from Aquatic.
They're from Tetra Tech. It might be the confusion.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tetra Tech. I'm sorry.
They're the limnology consultant on contract with the county.
And the herbicide consultant was Aquatech Next. so it's a different company.
Petra Tech.
And Harry, you didn't really get to introduce yourself. Maybe it would be helpful if you gave just a quick.
Well, I've been lake restoration work was back in 1974. My first aquatic plant management opportunity was 1975, and I've been working on aquatic plants and algae and overall water quality for a number of years. So basically, if it's independently published by scientifically peer-reviewed scientific journal, I've had an option to work with it, plan with it, study it, make mistakes with it, and learn from it, as well as having success. So I'm not biased by what methodology to approach. My bias is what the data says is going to be the best and most proactive. Also, as far as putting together aquatic plant management plan, I was one of the 3 original co-authors for putting the manual together for the state of Washington years ago, last century. So that's why I'm here. I'm a resource that you can pull information from, and our team can pull. Have I made a mistake, or has it worked, or what did I know? Sometimes I don't.
Can I add something about the dredging?
Yeah.
We actually looked into dredging the Middle Lake, and due to the lack of depth and the amount of logs, pretty much every dredger, which I think there's only like 3 that will come out to the lake, they said that it was pretty much inconceivable that we could dredge the entire Middle Lake because there's so many logs and it's just not deep enough. And their machines are so massive, which is why I know one of our lake residents has taken it upon himself to build his own little weed cutter. I'm not going to name any names, but you know, all of us locals know who he is. But I mean, it's worked. It's worked for his area around his dock. So it'd be nice to be able to dredge, but
well, smaller dredging. You're talking about bigger equipment that uses,
yes,
bigger.
Yeah, it's like
you have to have a hydraulic dredge to overcome the logs and get around that and suck it out. And what
Alyssa, I think what Alyssa's
your neighbor
actually
is doing is a hydraulic type thing.
Harry, sorry, I think what Alyssa's actually referring to is a harvester for cutting plants,
yes,
not a dredge.
Oh, a harvester. That's totally
There's some
different.
confusion in terms there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, no, it's the harvester and the dredge. It's the one that sucks out the stuff on the bottom, and the one that cuts, cuts the tops off and then leaves the bottoms.
So yeah, so I think that's a little nuance there. The dredging I think they're talking about is if you do have a full scale large dredge, is to
Right.
come in and do large. It's a little bit different. So, but I think we're moving.
Yeah, it's different. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
and
then
Doris is right.
Ultimately, maybe the North Lake will get no transportation up to their lake. So, I think that has to be in consideration, that you can go back and forth between the 2 lakes. So possibly the long-term result is that North Lake will get no transportation up to their lake.
No, Lena, that's not what anyone's saying. Lena, it's not about, not doing anything opposed to doing something. It's trying to figure out the best case scenario for everyone. And the problem is there's short-term situations and there's long-term situations. And the short-term situation would be, let's just spray the whole Middle Lake. But then all of those weeds are going to die off. They're going to become sludge in the bottom of the lake. and then they're gonna regrow next year. Maybe not as thick, but they're still gonna regrow. And that's my only concern is it's just, it'd be nice to find a,
I think we're into the weeds again. Let's
Yeah.
move on.
okay.
So
I'm gonna
I
mute.
see that Marissa has moved on to our next whiteboard, and I see some activity. What we were thinking here is we'll take information from the previous board and this discussion and come up with a problem statement that incorporates probably distilling down some of these, like there was some grouping going on. We can make those a little more succinct, come up with a nice clean statement that again can be used for your permits and for other grant applications. So one of the other components of the plan is to come up with very specific goals, bonus points if it's something that's a measurable, attainable goal. But we put a couple of sort of overarching goals in here. We just came up is improve water quality. If you had a really specific known issue at the lake, like let's say it was on the 303D list for pH because of dense aquatic plants, then that goal might be, you know, improve pH conditions so that it's not listed anymore. But then I think it'd be great to, there's been a lot of discussion about lilies. I see things popping up, but if there are things with say milfoil, where given the amount that you have, it might be a realistic goal to eradicate milfoil from the lake. So if there are more plant species specific goals, this is where these can get kind of fleshed out. Or maybe you see another category instead of the overarching, maybe there is a water quality or protect fish and wildlife type category. We just were kicking around ideas.
Allison, you have your hand raised. Did you want me to put one on for you?
No, I have a question that kind of goes towards a solution. I remember in a past meeting that the conversation around the arrowhead weed was one of the reasons why we may not have milfoil so bad. Can anybody that might know anything about that speak to that?
I guess I can. I mean, there's no, published research or data that's really looked at that. This is just my suspicion. So I can't say for sure that that's the case. I think that it's just those two invasive plants are competing, and I think the Sagittaria may be winning, but it's probably as a result of the county working for many years on getting it down to very low levels so that maybe the spread of those fragments can't take hold. But again, I really have no idea if that's scientifically valid just because we haven't looked at it closely. Harry or Tony, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would say milfoil is one of those plants that sure, it likely could come up in the same place year after year, but I know Harry and Shannon and I have all worked on projects where we've seen shifts, and some of that has to do with where sediment gets deposited and literally buries the plant. And so you might not see it very bad for a year or two. It's not that it's not there. It's just that it's not peaking up. And then add to that divers, add to that potentially turbid water, add to that the slender arrowhead. There could be a lot of competing factors why that might be happening. But in general, Allison, milfoil is one that does tend to change quite a bit from year to year. So there's not always a simple answer to that question. So.
And we have little milfoil. So we have a lot of lily pads. So, my thing would be to eradicate the lily pads.
Yeah, I mean these are your goals, and this is what when we're putting all the pieces together, trying to assess what is realistic for the dollar, that's where the rubber hits the road and what then becomes an attainable goal. Or it's over a very different lifespan than some of us on this call might be able to witness, shall we say. So, that's where we have to really evaluate what we can and can't do. And a lot of times we set out with the goal of eradication, but then we realize we're just gonna have to live with maybe 20% cover. And that's kind of the best we can do for $50,000 a year or 200 labor hours a summer, or, you know, whatever the metric is. So it's not that it's not a goal that we don't want to strive for, but we also have to put that in perspective of what it's going to take to get there. So if that makes sense.
Well, do you want to go between the North and the South Lake? That is the goal. So if you don't want to go between the North and the South Lake, then okay. That's
So
okay.
Lena,
I like that. That's a goal that there may be different ways to get to that goal, to have navigation between those two.
Lena, I put that as a sticky note for you, navigate between North and South Basin. If you have any other specific ones, let me know. Does anybody else have one that is not able to write on the Jamboard that I can put down for them? Christine?
Sorry, my computer is still jammed up. I'd like to see the habitat improved for the native plant species. One thing I was wondering is, like along our shoreline, we do have a lot of slender arrowhead. And if I were to try to manually remove that, are there ways to encourage native plants to recruit in? Or are there examples of other lakes where can you plant little starts? Or I don't know, but I'd like to try to not only kind of remove the invasive plants, but try to give native plants a little startup or a little boost up.
Yeah, I really like that goal. I feel like restoration is a term that gets used a lot in river and stream scenarios, but we don't often get the chance to talk about that with lakes. You know, and having areas where you propagate native plants, for example, or expand populations of a native species that's already in the lake, you know, because there's ways that you could harvest tubers, for example. We used to do this at the aquatic lab all the time. We would get tubers from one system, grow them out in the greenhouse to do experiments where you could do the same thing. You grow them out and then you could plant them back. You wouldn't want to do that from, you know, this was pre-quagga zebra mussel concerns, but we would get stock from Minnesota, for example, because there are places that just grow tubers and ship them out for aquatic plant horticulturists and hobbyists. So you want to be very mindful of that. And I would do that from the lake. I certainly wouldn't go elsewhere, but I really like that idea. It seems like that's something we don't spend enough time on in these types of projects.
Yeah, well, I've been really impressed, and I want to participate this year in the Lakewise program, and I know that there's, you know, kind of discussion and opportunities about like revegetating and planting native plants along your shoreline, but I was also interested in the submersive aspect of that. So I would be really interested in that.
Yeah, I definitely, I like adding that as a component to the plan for sure. You know, making some recommendations, and a lot of things there's a really good ideas that might not fit as part of a plan, but one aspect of the plan to consider is, you know, put things in there that you really want, because then it's documented, it's been well vetted by this committee and then the larger community as a whole, that maybe we can't do that right now. Maybe that's not a priority for our next grant cycle, but let's think about a planting plan. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but it can give you some directions on how to cultivate the plants, which plants to get, you know, how to clear a space for them, just like you would in your garden. You know, you got to clear out the right weeds and get the right soil and protect them and blah, blah, blah. So that could be a goal to develop a planting plan. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and that's a really good idea for long-term, because, you know, back in the 80s, that was, we did that in BC and in Idaho and Washington. We did a few lakes where we demonstrated that ability to take a native plant and the invasives and plant the native plant in there. It takes an ongoing maintenance, like the shoreline does. When you plant something there, you have to maintain it to make it survive. But once it's, if you keep clearing out the invasives around it so it can still be there, it works. So it is an ongoing thing, and it's something that through citizen involvement long-term, like Tony said, is an option to really consider. But for short-term, it's how and what can we identify because of the fisheries and other things that we got to consider to use, and where do we get those plants? So there are some things to consider, but it's a good idea, yes.
I agree too. I would be totally willing to participate in that. Like, I do not have a manicured front beach. It's totally natural besides the bulkhead that was put in there back in the 60s. And I would love to have some natural growth. Right now, I think it's mainly, what is it? The yellow flag iris, which obviously I need to dig out, but I would love to be able to replace that with something natural that won't be washed away when the lake comes up to my bulkhead.
So the good news there is you don't have to wait for this plan to do that. Go to lakewise.org, sign up for a site visit. We have planting plans, we have free native plants. It's all ready for you, just waiting there.
I will do.
Hey, Marissa, I thought you said that all the free native plants were out of stock, or that was no longer an option because the funding for that was terminated.
We used to, we had a grant where we were installing the free native plants, doing the site prep and planting, but that's gone. But we still have funding for a limited number of free native plants for shoreline restoration. So, Yep, that's there. And we don't have, we had a landscape designer doing professional design plans. We don't have that, but our watershed steward can help you to develop a design plan that works for you. It just won't look quite as nice.
Awesome.
And also,
I mean,
just
the planting will look nice. The plan won't look as nice.
just having the information available would be great, because I'd be willing to buy the plants myself if I knew what to plant.
Yep, and we can help with that. And a lot of people do a mix of natives, and they buy some ornamentals that, you know, maybe are their favorites from their own nursery and add those in and make it their own. But we do have those free native shrubs and bushes, trees for any resident that's interested in living on a lake or a stream, actually, too.
So Marissa, we have 15 minutes. How are you feeling about our goals board here?
The one thing I noticed, I know there's a lot going on here. I feel like there's a couple gaps. Maybe we could discuss a little more in depth on a couple species. I don't see anything about purple loosestrife. And I think there is a big question on the Sagittarian, what those goals should be. And then the third thing I'm seeing is I see a lot of a call for education, but I'm not exactly sure what the education means. Maybe a couple people could clarify that. If is it education about working on the current plants like the loosestrife, the knotweed, and the others, or the lilies, or is it education on preventing new plants, or what is the education? Those are the questions I had just from looking at it. I don't know if any.
This is Ron. Education in my mind is letting the homeowners know specifically what they can do to help eradicate the noxious weeds. Because a lot of what we have is, I know when we were on Middle Lake, well, we've got these yellow flag iris. I don't know if we can remove them or not. So we're going to kind of remove them on the sly and hope nobody complains. You know, are we going to get in trouble if we remove lily pads? we've got so many regulations around water bodies and lakes. I think a lot of people are afraid to do this. And if they knew they could, it would make a big difference.
That's why the internet permit that a citizen can get by just downloading the rules that says you can do up to half an acre of control without herbicides, no herbicides, but a manual control, digging out the rhizomes and digging out, cutting back the plants, using bottom barriers, whatever, as long as it's not a herbicide, or dredging, those extreme dredging, you can do that. So you can go after those yellow lilies or yellow iris.
But it's also written in the aquatic plant management that you can only remove lily pads during the month of August. But when I talked to Jamie last year, she said, no, you can do it all year. But if it's written that you can only do it in August, then going to the internet doesn't solve it.
Well, no, but that was a plan that was put in after we wrote that. We didn't have that in there. But no, the permit is a permit with Fish and Wildlife. And it allows you to do shoreline management both on the shore and in the water, as long as you do not exceed too much area and you're not too physically disrupted. So in other words, herbicide and dredging require a strong permit, but removal of the lilies is not limited to a time of the year. You can do it whenever you're able.
But it's written that way, so that's a problem.
Not in the permit. No. And so I'm not sure which manual you're talking about.
Let's follow up with you on that one offline. Is that Ron Johnson?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And,
we'll have to.
And my point though is we've got all this stuff available on the internet, etc. But unless you know exactly where to look, you're not going to find it.
That's really helpful.
You got to know to look. So we have to educate the people to say, hey, there is information out there. You can do this, you know, all this good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Allison has had her hand up for quite a while.
So I'm a marketing and communication specialist, and one of the things we do is look at studies as to how people take in information and actually retain it so they can actually use it. Just having something on the internet, one or two things, most people aren't going to go to. They'll read it once and then they forget. And Ruth and Ron are right. That was a big deal. We need to let people know what the weeds are. I think some of us still struggle with which ones are which. It's like a multifaceted sort of a thing, and it needs to be Lake Roesiger Community Club backed by Snohomish County. And then we also have to do more than just computers, because there's a lot of people. It's like with all of the people moving in right now, there's a ton of people that don't know what's going on or what the problems are. And so it'd be nice to be able, like, I know Michelle's got a thing where she turns in a little packet of information to people when they move in, add that to the packet, make sure that stuff's posted at the store, make sure that it goes out twice a year. There's a litmus test that says they've got to hear something 6 times again before they can actually respond back and repeat it back. So it's gonna be social media, it's gonna be, you know, internet, it's gonna be everything. So it's not going to be, again, it's not going to be one simple, easy thing. So, and it's got to be identifying for people what the bad stuff is and how much can be taken out and how it can be taken out.
That's really helpful, Allison. I might pick your brain before we do the recorded video.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we move to the next, kind of our next steps, Marissa?
Do you feel like you have what you need for the goals for each of the plants to be able to move forward in terms of the management options to explore?
I feel like we, as you mentioned, I do feel like we're a little bit lacking in some of the plant species goals. I wonder if that kind of gets back to Allison's point about maybe not being as clear as we are as biologists that have worked with these species for a couple of years. You know, maybe asking that is too big of an ask to dive into some very plant species goals. I think the lilies are ones that everyone can wrap their minds around. The others, maybe an eradicating milfoil might still be one that people can relate to because that's kind of been on the radar. But
we've got a hand up.
Hi, it's me, Michelle. I have a question about the impact in the arrowhead, as long as we're talking about plants here. The arrowhead plants that I have in front of me, they're kind of at my dock, actually hold back some of my beach. It's actually formed kind of a barrier and a block there. And I'm concerned that if we remove all of that arrowhead, because it is an invasive species, then I'm going to start seeing some sliding of the earth there at my beach. Right at my dock there. And also, I had another question. They've been there forever. And I know myself, I see the fish all around it all the time. Is it going to interrupt the fish and their use of that area if it is gone? Am I going to lose those fish that I enjoy watching? Or kind of, the arrowhead has been here as long as I have. And I don't know how come it's invasive. Why is it invasive? What is it doing that makes it invasive? I guess I just don't understand that plant well.
It's not what it's doing necessarily that makes it invasive. It's considered non-native because it is not native to the state of Washington. But having said that, you could have a number of plants that are native to the state of Washington, all of the Pacific Northwest over to Alaska, that are problematic. Elodea is a very good example of a plant that's widely considered native, but is also can be really problematic. Coontail, which you don't have, is also one that can be really problematic. So to say it's like Vallisneria in Oregon here is not considered native. It's a beautiful plant, doesn't bother anybody. Nobody ever really tries to manage it. It's just non-native. So a lot of it gets back to the listings that the state has for these species because they don't want it to spread to other water bodies. So it might not be a nuisance is a term I like. It might not be a nuisance in your situation. And I get it. It's probably stabilizing some of the sediments and the banks and is probably kind of desirable for your property. And that wouldn't surprise me a bit. So it gets back to semantics and how the state looks at those and how the funding.
Yeah, I think I would add to the fact that before it was there was a diversity of other native plants there, likely based on the few spots where it hasn't been taken over. There are other native plants that are growing and thriving, and that diversity has pretty much been eliminated in most of the lake and has been replaced by the Sagittaria over time. But it's been there since, as you know, it's been a long time.
I'm sorry, how do you put it on a priority of the plant species goals? How does that become prioritized over the other invasive species that we are discussing?
I would say in that case, given how widespread it is, then we can talk about it in terms of, okay, we are willing to live with this plant in some percentage of, and we don't have to decide on that number now, but it might just be in some percentage of what's the littoral zone, the more shallow part of the lake, which is going to be a lot for this particular example. So that's a specific goal for that plant. Like maybe we don't want to see it get deeper than some particular contour because then it's crowding out another native submersed plant. So that, I guess that's what I apologize, that might have been something that, glad you asked the question, because that's something we probably could have made more clear, I could have, is the goal for these different species are going to be very different. So in this case, eradication is probably highly unlikely. So what level are we willing to live with? And just off the top of my head, I invite Marissa and Harry to chime in here, but I think, okay, let's not let it grow deeper than 5 feet, for example, or let's make sure it's not more than X% of the littoral zone.
Well, Antonia, I think part of it is that's what we're trying to figure out is what is your goal with this plant? what I'm hearing from you say is, my goal is to do nothing with this plant. I like it. So, and the fact that it's not on this board from anybody hardly, except seeing there's a couple people saying, well, what is the impact? Should we be worried about it? So I think partly it's we want to hear from you is this something that's prioritized?
Yeah, one reason it's classified as invasive is because Fish and Wildlife and the fisheries is concerned about the interaction with the invertebrates with this particular plant. How productive are the invertebrates in the root zone and living on the plant? Is it diminishing the invertebrate and the food base for essentially the salmon downstream as well as the fish in the lake itself, but also to provide food that moves downstream too, in terms of direct invertebrates in the lake. Then other fish come and they move downstream that provide more of the salmon and other things downstream. So it's complicated why they're classified as invasive and non-native and of a classification. But like Tony said, there's some give and take because we haven't seen a whole lot of it, this plant in this state. So it doesn't seem to be doesn't spread like Eurasian water milfoil. So maybe some plants in some of the areas when there's a prioritization isn't going to reduce the food chain for other species outside of the plants. So it's not just the plant dismissed competition, it's also the food chain.
Good point. I think I apologize. I didn't see which hand came up first. Yeah, maybe
Lena's was up first.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess I would like to ask, what is the priority with the lily pads?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to uncover here is, I mean, you all have these goals of what you'd like to see happen. It's on us to try and take this information, distill it down, find out the pros and the cons, the costs, and what's doable. I'm not sure that we're going to come up with the 11 people on this call one specific goal for that plant, but I think it's a clearinghouse to get all thoughts on paper and everyone feel like their thoughts are heard. That's how I view this.
I believe Alyssa had her hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, to go back to invasive species of plants, the yellow flag iris, because I have a lot of it on my beach. How deep do I have to dig down to get the roots out? Because I have dug down what I feel is pretty deep, at least a good 2 feet. Like, how do I get it all out so it doesn't come back, I guess? Because I cut off all the flowers before they've bloomed for the past, what, 2 or 3 years now? So I'm trying to figure out, how do I get rid of them?
I would say check out the document from King County, and I'm not going to totally punt back to them, but there's a lot of really good information in there. And I'm sure there's a contact name there that for the short term. I mean, the purpose of this plan is to help lay out priorities and then get you guys funding for this one. And it's not necessarily a roadmap for how deep to dig, I guess.
Exactly. Well, and that's another thing I want to point out to like people that think that we're not fighting for like one way or the other during this meeting. We're trying to figure out road plans, and there's going to be a couple different plans that we come up with that the whole like community votes on, and I think that needs to be focused on not just our own prerogative, but we're going to have to deal with give and take and coming up with the best plan and the best solutions, and then let the whole lake vote on it. And so this isn't going to be, you know, fix it all right now. Like this is planning right here. And I think people need to recognize that, is that we need to work together and figure out what's best for the lake and make everyone happy.
I hate to cut off the discussion, but it is now 8:32. So we are now 2 minutes over our time lot. And I know that Tony has a couple of more slides that she wants to get to. I hate to be the bearer of, to be the timekeeper, but that is unfortunately my job.
It is your job. You have other jobs. Shannon's also our project manager and an engineer, and she plays a biologist on TV. So she has a lot of other very important roles, to be clear. I'm gonna maybe let Marissa chime in here if she has anything to add, but do we have one more slide before this? Yeah. So we kind of talked about, you know, the timeline, and you know, this is where we are right now. And as you said, Alyssa, we're having this meeting to gather information to develop this problem statement, to use the information we've talked about now to help identify goals. We discussed kind of a higher level view of some control options, and I'm seeing where there's some gaps in the communication that I appreciate Allison chiming in about. And so our next step, I might even squeeze something in here that we're going to develop this problem statement and the goals, and hopefully let you guys have eyes on that before you just see this big plan. But as Alyssa was saying, you know, the idea is maybe come up with a suite of alternatives, kind of like you would for an EIS. Like, what happens if you do nothing? What happens if you go throw everything you have at this? What happens if you go only mechanical or herbicides, or, you know, we'll take a look at all the concerns and try and come up with a suite of options to then vote on. But that'll be included in the draft plan that will be presented to you guys, and we'll get more feedback. And then we'll develop this online presentation for the community to vote on, and then we'll finalize that plan. And the idea is you guys run with it, you implement it, you start getting some money to fund what you hopefully mostly agree on. So next, I just want to point out just in the next slide really quick, Marissa, about what goes into this. And these are sort of the chapters, and you know, there's a little bit that can morph into this, but this is kind of what it will look like. And we can send out a link if you guys already have it for this citizens guide for developing a plan. And that's, Harry mentioned he developed that with a couple other folks a while back, and that's what we'll be using as a roadmap. That's what ecology uses. And so that's kind of where we're going from here. So I don't want to cut off anybody's closing thoughts, but I guess while I have it, I just really want to say how, again, I appreciate you all being part of this and volunteering your time and your heart and soul to protect the lake you clearly love. And it means a lot to me to be a part of it, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I don't know, real quick before we go, or David, it looks like you're still here. I don't know if Brian already signed off, but if we are sending out group communications to the group, is it best to send it? Yeah, is there a chair of the committee, or what should be the communication channels? I should have asked that earlier, but if you're on here.
Brian is still here.
Yeah.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Either way, you can send it to me and I can distribute it. Group
okay. So we'll coordination through you, Brian, then.
And your hair looks adorable.
I think the communication should go directly to all involved, not through filtered.
The communication can go through the president of the board, and he will send it out without any alterations, guaranteed.
Yeah, yeah. And when I say that, I mean just like just to streamline communication, so we don't end up on large group
Yes,
emails.
Brian will send it out without any alterations. No worries.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll be posting everything to the website because you're absolutely right, Lena. It's essential that this be super transparent and that the whole community is involved. So.
Yeah.